Hey guys, I'm Jenn.
And I'm Dalton.
And this is Remit Reality IRL. We are so excited to be partnering with SHILLR to bring you guys this series. I think we have a really exciting one today.
Yeah, today we're actually going to be interviewing one of the most controversial
or influential founders, depending on where you sit in the space.
So, Pacman, how you doing? Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Love the space.
Thank you for coming. It is such an honor to be doing this. I think this is your first IRL interview like this. Oh man,
I'm so excited.
I'm
so excited.
So I just want to dig in. You have a particularly interesting background. You dropped out of high school at 16, which I think is insane, incredibly awesome. And then a year later, you found yourself at Y Combinator. And I believe you built a company there, and then you went to MIT afterwards, right? Can you take us back to maybe right around the time that you were deciding to go back to MIT? Like, what was going through your mind? What were you working on, and what did you want to work on?
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So basically, as you you did your research, which is awesome. I did. So I left high school, went to Silicon Valley. I was originally in Boston, so I was going to school there. Moved to Silicon Valley. Started working at a company called Teespring, and it was always my dream to basically go to Silicon Valley and go through Y Combinator. So I was fortunate enough to, after spending a year as a software engineer at Teespring, go and start a company and go through Y Combinator. And during that process, something that I also just realized is I was like a 17-year-old kid at the time. I was like, I really wanted to go to school and have the college experience, basically. So that was really the motivation. I actually really just wanted to get socialized in a way. MIT was kind of like a weird school to do it.
I was like, bro, the guy wants college experience. He's like, yeah, I'm gonna go to MIT.
Yeah,
I'm like, dude, that's epic.
Actually, it was kind of an interesting thing because most schools are it's kind of difficult to get in as like a dropout. MIT is more like merit based, so I was able to do all the tests and everything like that, and I was fortunate that they accepted a high school dropout effectively. I went there, and it was cool because I got to go at the same time as all of my peers. So I would have gone when I was 18 normally, and I was able to go when I was 18 to school. The motivation was really just I really wanted to have the college experience. And then the second thing, which is actually something I haven't really shared as much, but one of the nice things about college is that it's like a really dense network of similar people, and it's a really good place to find co-founders. So I explicitly really wanted to find a good co-founder. And MIT has an incredibly dense network of engineers. So that is actually how I ended up finding my co-founder was through my MIT network. And that was a secondary goal.
Wow. Did you know going into MIT what exactly you wanted to build? You're like, I need a technical co-founder so I could build X? No,
I just knew that I wanted a technical co-founder just in general. I was an engineer myself, so it wasn't necessarily technical co-founder, but I wanted a co-founder, and I just had this inclination that there would be a lot of potentials at MIT.
And you were right.
Yeah.
And so where along that road did crypto come in, and what was that kind of early start there? Because obviously everything that you have done to this point, you've iterated very fast. You're like, okay, I get my 1 year in and then I'm out. I learned what I needed to learn, and now I'm going to the next thing. Was it similar with crypto, and where did that start, and how did the early journey look?
Yeah, I would say it was not similar with crypto. It's not I necessarily prior to crypto wanted to pivot or alter course that quickly. It was more so just once I felt there was a different direction that was optimal. It was just that's the only thing that makes sense to do.
Right.
For crypto, it was my second year at school. I had really wanted to go and start a company again. I knew my first semester at MIT, I was there's no way I'm finishing school, because I was very inclined to go and start something again. But I was in my second year, and I was starting to explore, and that was also when I met my co-founder Anthony. Basically, the story there is I had a friend Efe who was this really brilliant engineer. He was an IMO champion from Turkey. And just a little tidbit at MIT, it's if you're an international student, it's really hard to get in. So if you're like an international student at MIT, it's like you have to basically be like one of the top
Cream of
like
the crop.
math people
Yeah.
of your country. So he was like this IMO champion from Turkey, and basically as like a side gig in school, he also kind of like ran this like recruiting agency.
Oh my
So he
God.
was basically just like connected with all the engineers at school, and we were good friends. So I basically just asked him, I was like, who are the best builders that you know at school? And then he introduced me to Anthony. And Anthony is like hands down, even amongst my MIT peers, he's like the best builder I've ever met. So as soon as we met, we basically kind of like immediately hit it off. Started working on various side projects, and we eventually started looking into crypto, and we discovered this protocol called Handshake, which is kind of extremely niche now, kind of like forgotten, but at the time it was this like really hot protocol, and for us as engineers, it was very attractive because it was solving a technical problem using crypto in a very like concrete way. Basically, it's just like decentralizing the domain name system, which is mostly decentralized, but actually like at its core has these like centralized elements. So for us as engineers, we're like, wait, this protocol actually could improve the security of the internet in a way that's like very, very concrete. And so we were attracted to it, and we're like, okay, like what can we build to like basically accelerate its adoption? I think that kind of ended up becoming like a theme in terms of like what we built is just kind of focusing on like market acceleration. But basically we were building on that protocol for around 3 years. And we stuck with it for 3 years. And eventually we basically kind of realized that it probably is something that the world will adopt, but on like an extremely long time horizon, and that we weren't necessarily the best positioned to go and kind of like steward it. So we ended up selling it to Namecheap, which is the business that we built. We sold it to Namecheap, which is the like second largest domain registrar in the world. But we stuck with that for 3 years before we pivoted.
And was it right after you sold that to Namecheap that you worked on Blur?
Yeah, it was basically like immediately afterwards.
So where do we go from like Web3 domains to like Bloomberg trading terminal for NFTs?
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually, the funny thing is, the experiences at Namebase ended up being extremely influential for Blur. So what Namebase was, which was the first business, was two things. It was a domain registrar for Handshake. So it was like similar to GoDaddy or Namecheap, you can like buy and sell domain names on it. It was also a crypto exchange for Handshake because there was no infrastructure for HNS, which is like the protocol. There was no infrastructure for it. We had to build everything from scratch. So we ended up building not only this like application layer domain name marketplace, but we also built the infrastructure layer. We built a fiat on-ramp, right? So you can buy and sell it with like your actual like dollars. We built a BTC HNS token exchange, like spot exchange. So it was like very similar to like Coinbase Pro or Binance, that sort of spot exchange. So we built all this infrastructure, and we had to basically like learn those skills and learn how to build like a real-time exchange. And also on the marketplace or on the domain name side, we also built like a marketplace as well. So the transition to Blur was actually like very, very natural because when I first got into NFTs, the thing that I realized was I was like, oh, this is basically the same thing as like a domain name marketplace. It's just for like more assets. Like the domain names are non-fungible as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like I already had a lot of experience with that, and it felt very natural to get into it. And the story there is also kind of interesting. Happy to get into that, but I know I've been speaking for a lot, so I'll just pause.
I mean, that's what you're here for.
Dude, the market acceleration is actually the thing that I'm most interested in because as we have seen, obviously we were chatting a little bit before the show about Twitter and stuff like that and how Blur is a very polarizing platform, right? Like people have said that on one hand, they're like, okay, it added market efficiency. It's added things to the space that we didn't have before. You obviously had the OSF and Mando trade that was like massive and iconic in and of itself, them dumping on Machi and stuff like that. But then that became a whole nother layer to the space where on the other side, we've seen this market acceleration of things going to zero that we never thought would go to zero, right? Bored Apes are now trading at 10, 11 ETH. And when Blur came out, they were trading around 70 ETH, right? So like these blue chip holders are now down bad. And on their side, they're like, dude, Blur ruined ETH NFTs. But then on the other side, people are like, actually, it just sped up the process of what was going to inevitably happen of whales not being able to exit out of positions because this thing was non-fungible. OpenSea bids at that point were basically non-existent, right? And like, how do you kind of see that process of the early days, like really shaping the ETH NFT ecosystem that we see today?
Yeah, very, very happy to get into this. So, first of all, I think it's probably helpful to just like share the origin of like how I got into NFTs, because it's all related actually. What ended up happening was in 2021, I had an acquaintance. I think he goes in Web3 by Worm Emoji, but I knew him as. I'm not going to dox. I don't know if he's doxed, but he's pretty doxed. But I knew him personally because he had gone through YC as like a teenager as well. So we knew each other through that. And we were in a group chat, and he pinged in this group chat, and he was like, "Hey, I'm working on this like project. If you guys want, like, check it out." And it was a blip maps. This was like March 2021 at the time, and I basically checked it out, and I was like, you know what, like I'll throw a few $100 at it and mint the blip map. It was like $300. And then I basically held it up until like its eighth, and I sold it around like 25 ETH. 25, 30 ETH. And after that, I was just like totally hooked. And I was like, what is like,
You're like,
what
how
is
do I
going
do
on?
this more?
Like, I hit an 80x and now I'm good to go.
Yeah. So it was crazy to me. And then I was like, started digging into it. And then I was like, oh, wow, these are basically like, domain names, but just for other assets.
I love that that's how your brain processed it. Instead of being like, oh, these are NFTs, you're like, oh, this is just like domain names. I've been doing this shit for like 3 years.
Yeah,
like, it's crazy.
It was very, very familiar. Actually, a lot of like domainers, it's like a weird industry, but a lot of domainers are also into NFTs.
Yeah,
it's
not
the
surprising,
The overlap makes like sense. But basically, I started digging into it, and I really fell in love with the trading side of it. I started like flipping NFTs. Back in the day, like reveals used to take a really long time, so I did some like scripting stuff to kind of like scrape the reveals and kind of like programmatically figure out which were the best ones.
The good old days, bro.
Yeah, those were like it was really, really crazy times. And as I was doing all this, I couldn't help but notice that all the infrastructure was extremely bad. Like it was just like slow, it was clunky, and it was just like wasting time. And basically, it's like at the time, it's like you would basically be using like 10 different tools. Like OpenSea was really slow, it was clunky. It took like 30 clicks to do something. It was very, very painful. And I knew that for myself as a user, I wanted something better. I also just knew that in terms of the market development, typically any sort of like financialized market, it professionalizes over time. Like every single financialized market, whether it's like eBay sellers, kind of first started off as this like online flea market. Now the top eBay sellers are like professional businesses. Same thing with like Etsy, right? Like the initial sellers, they were like like moms that were like selling something on the side. Now it's like they're like real legit businesses that are like selling things on Etsy, and that's just like for like a non-financialized market. In crypto, which is way more kind of like hyper financialized, it's even more so, right? So if you think about like the progression of exchanges, the first exchanges were kind of these like normie friendly retail exchanges like Coinbase, right? Like that's like where everything was initially. And then over time, what we've seen is there's a progression towards more professionalization and financialization. So it's like then you had like Binance, OKX, like BitMEX, perps were invented, and all of this additional advancement on top. This trajectory is basically how any sort of financialized market develops. So I knew that, again, like both as a user, I wanted something better, and then just from like a market level perspective, it was always going to kind of professionalize more from there.
From your builder's perspective. Got it. I think like one of the things that also kind of like came out of Blur is obviously incentives. And it's my understanding that from the moment you guys kind of started to conceive Blur, you knew incentives were going to be a massive part of the platform and your user acquisition strategy. And I think the word the phrase you tend to use is user alignment. I want to double tap on Dalton's question of like, on one half of the spectrum of like Web3 people, you have people saying like Blur killed ETH NFTs, which I don't agree with personally. But on the other hand, there are actual tangible impacts that we're seeing on a lot of these collections. Like, what are the discussions internally when you see a blue chip like Bored Ape have multiple lending death spirals, a massive floor fall, and like talking about how that works with user alignment? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, for this question, there's the like general commentary on incentives like as like a general construct. And then there's also, we can double click on like Blur incentives specifically and like their impact. And happy to talk about both. I think maybe I'll talk about like the general stuff first and then get into Blur. So the reason why we thought about it this way from the beginning, for context, actually pretty much every exchange, not talking about like NFT marketplaces specifically, but like a token exchange. Because if you look at like the shape of these protocols or businesses, they're all quite similar. They all bring on market makers of some form, right? Usually the traditional way was you go to a market maker and you basically sign some sort of agreement with them, and you're usually either like paying them a fee or you're doing like fee plus like profit share. This is something that is like very, very common. Many of the exchanges also had their own like internal market making operations, which was somewhat controversial, but that was basically like the practice. And the way we thought about it was more so along the lines of we believed that we could create more efficient market structure in terms of just like a better marketplace. And in order to get there, we needed the users in the community to basically rally behind it and contribute to it. If the community were to basically just like switch over 100% over to like Blur immediately, it would create a lot of value. And so
value in terms of like liquidity.
Value in terms of liquidity, but there's just also like inherent value. Like at the time when Blur launched, like OpenSea was valued at like 10 billion, right? So you can basically think of it like that market structure in terms of like a NFT marketplace, whichever NFT marketplace it is that's like leading, is basically worth like 10 billion.
Yeah.
Right. And it happens to be worth 10 billion in a structure that is like rewarding the equity holders of OpenSea. But if it was actually inhabited, if that market structure was inhabited by a decentralized protocol, that 10 billion could actually be realized by the contributors to that protocol, by the holders of that protocol, right? By the users of it. And so, the goal was basically, can we make Blur that market structure? And in order to do that, we wanted the community to basically contribute to it. And so the whole idea behind the point system was, can we basically define a system that allows users to contribute to that outcome, right? It's not like the value is coming out of nowhere. Like we know there's value in this market structure if it's achievable. That's why we had confidence in being able to deploy this point system and having there be something to back it at the end of the day.
It's kind of like your users are your market makers.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the users, every user is inherently kind of like a market maker. Like whether you are, kind of doing it professionally or not. Exactly. It's like if you list or you bid, you're doing the job of the market maker. So, from that perspective, it was like, okay, if you're a user and you're contributing that way, can we actually like calculate your contribution and basically like come up with a formula for it and actually show you, hey, here's how much value your contribution is producing. And then in that way, we can actually kind of distribute the value of that market structure to the users in a fair way, effectively. So that was like a lot of the thinking behind it.
It's so interesting to hear this from your perspective, because there's also Blur. Prior to Blur, we had OpenSea, then LooksRare tried to come in, and that was unsuccessful. And then you had X2Y2 come in, also unsuccessful. And that was in that like Christmas time where it was just like, you had the SOS airdrop. And then everybody was like super like, yeah, like NFTs are going. And then like NFTs went, and then like everything died. But like, we're not going to talk about that. But
that's very like OG. I'm impressed that you remember all of that history.
That was good times.
Yeah.
But what I think happened there was, this is pre-NFT finance, right? Like when Blur came in, there was like NFT perps were starting, and like NFT perp was gaining a lot of traction. I think their biggest volume day was like 12 million, right? And like all of this was still kind of hinged on like oracles that were feeding off of LooksRare, X2Y2, Blur, and OpenSea, right? And now if you're paying attention to NFT finance, you still see the same oracles, but like LooksRare floor is like 22 ETH. Like we were talking about BendDAO, death spirals and stuff like that, right? Like you see LooksRare at 22 ETH, and BendDAO is still taking the feed from that floor. And I'm like, this is not the floor, right? How do you kind of see the incentivization of these market makers impacting NFT finance tools, and like how, because obviously Blur and the Blur API is pretty like closed source. Like there's not a lot of sharing going on here, but Blur is such a big part of the ecosystem. How do you see this kind of playing out? Especially you have Blast, you have Blend, and Blur. It's like a huge ecosystem that you have, but it's also incentivized, and there are bad people that are taking it. They're not bad people, but they have like ill intent behind this because they're just farming. So like, do you see this incentivized liquidity as people like actually wanting things? We see farmers all the time, like they get dumped on and then they dump on the next farmer and then they manipulate the floors. So yes, they're market making, but it's with ill intent. So like, how do you kind of see Blur, Blast, Blend all kind of flowing into the NFT finance ecosystem?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's like a number of topics that you touched on there. One is just in terms of the API, actually one of the like emergent just like properties is that we noticed a lot of like third-party APIs actually just like popping up that were like very good actually. I forget like the names of specific ones, but basically like we noticed that those APIs were just like popping up and were really good. So when it comes to individual implementations like BendDAO, for example, like not indexing the floor for whatever reason, it's I think that's more idiosyncratic. It's not like a systemic outcome. It's more so implementation specific, right?
Got
Like it is like very, very possible for BendDAO or like a player like BendDAO to actually like accurately track the floor. It's it's actually like pretty trivial. So I think that it's hard. And the interesting thing about like NFT finance is that there's so few players. It's really hard to, derive whether an outcome is like systemic versus just like idiosyncratic, right? So like,
Well, can we double click on that real quick? Because it's like, let's look at Blend, for example. You have a peer-to-peer perpetual lending model with basically 30-hour recallable loans. I think so many of the lending death spirals that we've seen more or less in the last year have kind of come from this like incentivized lending that we see on Blend, in addition to the fact that these loans can be recalled like that versus, fixed term or other peer-to-peer places where maybe the loan term is a little bit longer. Like, is that to you systemic or idiosyncratic?
yeah, so that's a great question. So now it's like clicking into specific incentivization programs. So happy to comment on both like the general Blur incentivization program and then Blend as well. We were originally talking about the Blur one, but let me do the Blend one first, since that's like the most recent. So basically, at a high level, the way to think about Blend is, actually, let me just like provide some like general context first. In terms of getting the ability to like borrow against your assets, that's something that already exists like prolifically on centralized exchanges, right? So like whether you're on Binance or OKX or any of these other exchanges, you can basically like if you hold like ETH, you can like borrow a stable coin against your ETH, and you have a flexible amount that you can borrow, and it's not like it has like a fixed duration, right? Like I can borrow against my ETH and keep that position open basically indefinitely, and it basically just gets like automatically closed if the collateral value versus like how much I borrowed ends up getting like too close. That's how it works on exchanges, and when you borrow against like, let's say if I have ETH and I borrow like $1,000 against my ETH, when I'm borrowing on like an exchange, what ends up happening is I'm actually paying interest on that borrow position, and that interest is actually dynamic. It's going to be dynamic based on like the market conditions. So like as like the liquidity like dries up, my interest rate is going to shoot up, and as there's like ample liquidity, my interest rate will go down. And then if the price of ETH crashes, then I'm basically going to get like auto liquidated. And so this is like the system that like powers all these exchanges. And you can talk about like the merits of it, but basically that system works like extremely well. It does lead to situations like even on centralized exchanges where we're all familiar with like liquidation spirals, right? Like that's just an inherent kind of like aspect of the system.
Right.
But basically that is that general system, while that is like liquidation spiral is like a negative property of the system, the positive property is that in the general course of things, it actually allows for liquidity to be freed up, right? Because instead of just being stuck in my 1 ETH, I can actually borrow against it and do other stuff with that, like 1,000 USDT that I just borrowed against. So that's the system. And the design of Blend is basically to go and replicate that system as much as possible for NFTs. And it's actually like quite similar. So when you borrow on Blend, you have a loan that you're paying interest on, and basically that loan is by default. Like, let's say I have a Bored Ape and I borrow, just to keep it simple, I borrow like 1 ETH, right? So it's like worth like 11 ETH and I borrow 1 ETH on it. The lender can call that loan, and it triggers like a 30-hour auction. And because the market is like mostly efficient, it is almost like definite that that loan is going to get refinanced by another lender. Right? So it's like, it'll be like a very low interest loan. It'll trigger into an auction, and then some other lender will step in and take it over. And so I can basically keep that loan open indefinitely. Then the question is like, oh, when does it get like liquidated, right? When does the lender trigger an auction and then it doesn't get refinanced? Well, it doesn't get refinanced when like the credit conditions of the market change. So like, let's say Bored Ape went from 11 ETH to like 2 ETH, right? Now this like 10% LTV loan is now actually a 50% LTV loan. At that point, there might actually be less lenders willing to loan against this, right? Or the lender might be willing to loan, but they're going to require a higher interest rate. And so this mechanism basically mirrors the centralized exchange in a way in which the loan is indefinite. It'll have a flexible interest rate based on like the credit conditions of the market, and then if the market turns too south, then you're gonna get like liquidated effectively, just like it would happen on a centralized exchange. So that's like the system design of Blend. It basically kind of like mirrors that experience on a SEX, just with like a decentralized lending protocol, which like Blend to me is actually like one of the coolest things that the contributors have like ever created. I think is like really neat. Now the incentivized lending portion of that, basically the entire purpose of the entire premise of Blend is that as long as the market is like relatively efficient, then it's gonna basically mirror that sex-like experience, and things will be processed like properly. Where it falls is like, let's say I'm a lender on a Bored Ape, and you're borrowing like 1 ETH against your Bored Ape, and it's like at 11 ETH. And I call that loan, and let's say I'm like the only lender that exists in the market. So even though anyone else could step in, and they should step in, because like when that loan gets, it's a great deal. I'm gonna get like 10 ETH on that. So I'm gonna, what is that, like 1100% like return? Like that's incredible. I should not be able to get that. But like, let's say I'm the only lender in the market that is looking at this. In that case, now this system is not working as intended because the market's just like inefficient, and it's not working because the system like doesn't work or is broken. It's just working because there's not enough attention on that market specifically. And so these like inefficiencies, like if you put $100 on the ground, for the most part, it's going to get picked up in New York City. Right. If you put $100 on the ground in like a forest, maybe it's never going to get picked up. Right. So the whole purpose of the Blend incentive is to basically provide a reason for lenders to basically be like observing these markets. And so giving them an incentive to participate in the market means that when there's like $100 bill on the ground, someone's going to pick it up eventually. So that all of that basically goes to say that I think that the incentives like generally work as intended, because there's enough eyes watching these like on-chain auctions that if there were a large like arbitrage that was possible, someone would come in and pick it up. If someone's not coming in and picking up, it's probably because the credit conditions did worsen to such an extent that it's perceived as like too risky to go and pick it up. And then it's going to get liquidated, which is like what should happen in that market condition.
Right. Well, and that's something that, if paying attention to the space, like obviously both of us are researchers, and we spend all our time, especially nowadays. Like this is like 15-hour don't leave your computer season. But you see certain marketplaces and lending platforms and things like that do have incentives that aren't catching bids on certain things, and it's actually really impressive. I think what you've done is you've really captured the attention via incentives or whatever you like I've always liked using Blur as a marketplace and things like that. And I prefer that to other marketplaces, right? But it's pretty cool to see these incentives actually working, whereas like other platforms are kind of failing with this.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why the incentives get like a bad rep is just because it's quite challenging to implement correctly. It's like very, very technical. So it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot with incentives. And we also see not just like poorly implemented incentives, like now that it's like more popular to do these like point programs, but not just like poorly implemented incentives, but also just almost like adversarial incentives where it's like the team is kind of like farming the farmers in a way. So there's like all these ways in which the incentives get implemented in like a suboptimal way. And I think that kind of, it just skews the perspective on it when it's like not the tool that's the issue. It's like not like fire that's the issue. It's like whether you're using the fire to build like a combustion engine or to like burn stuff down, right? So
That makes sense. I mean, high level, what do good incentives look like to you versus bad incentives?
yeah, there is a number of things. One of I guess one of the easiest things to control from like a builder perspective is just whether it's like adversarial or not. So like something that I see a lot now is you have some teams that are like I mentioned, just like farming the farmers, and what that looks like is maybe it's like an exchange that's incentivizing volume, and the exchange is also taking a fee at the same time. So basically, it's just like a value transfer from the farmers to the exchange to the team, and it's like a very like it's like an especially like malicious thing because like sometimes they'll also like not specify how long the
Trade needs
like
to
the
be
period
open, yeah.
is, right? So it's like this indefinite thing, and you're just giving them your fees, and they're collecting fees at the same time. And it's actually like super misaligned incentives because the users are basically transferring value, like losing money in the short term and giving that money to the team. The team is actually making money in a short time horizon, and the users are maybe going to make that money back in a long time horizon, but like it doesn't really matter to the team at that point because they already collected all the fees. So like that's like a very like adversarial situation because the team is earning on like a much shorter time horizon than the users, and they're also like directly earning from the users in like with those different time horizons. So that is like adversarial, and you kind of see like various instances of this like across the board, you know. Like on like every chain, right? Like it's just always going to be kind of like co-opted by these. I don't know if they're necessarily like bad actors. You know, they're not like necessarily malicious, but it kind of has this like malicious outcome. That's like one of the most common issues that I see.
Do you see this on Blast?
Yeah, I think that I haven't seen as much of it on Blast. But what I have seen is incentives. Now this is like the second issue, which is like incentives that I think are implemented suboptimally. So you know, sometimes like the thing that we always recommend to teams building a Blast is like incentivize liquidity, don't incentivize volume. It is like the number one most common thing for people to think to do is to incentivize volume. It's been tried so many times before in the NFT world, like, you know, LooksRare tried it, X2Y2 tried it. In the token world, Fcoin tried it. It was like an exchange back in the day. There are like so many protocols that I see just like incentivizing volume. And it's just like, I guess it's just like one of those things that people are just going to keep on doing for whatever reason. I think it's just because it's like, it sounds like it's like the right thing to incentivize, but it's not. The reason why it's not is because basically all of that does is it incentivizes like MEV people to basically come in and like arbitrage the incentive program in like a very like non-constructive way. So sometimes we see like teams, you know, gearing towards that, and then we try to basically step in and say, hey, like this is kind of like a suboptimal incentive scheme, and you should probably, you know, tweak it. And sometimes we'll like recommend ways to tweak it. It's up to the team to whether they want to like listen to that or not. But I would say it's like probably happening on Blast to an extent, but I don't think it's like happening in a malicious way. But it's definitely way, way, way less than where I see on like other ecosystems.
I think double clicking on that right there, because this is something that we're obviously seeing quite a bit right now, is like people are farming Blast, right? Like it's just part of the game. Especially right now, ETH NFT is trending down. Like people are trying to find the next place to park money, and people like congrats on how much TVL you guys locked up at such a rapid rate. Like you guys have really pushed that front, right? But one question I do want to ask is, how do you view incentivizing whales versus retail? And like, I think historically speaking, you guys have done an amazing job of like democratizing that and saying like, okay, like if you're doing the right things and you're playing the game, we're going to reward you, right? That being said, I also want to ask about like Sybil attacking and wallet spreading, and like, how do you view that? We've seen other projects that have done, rewarding that kind of behavior for vanity metrics and stuff like that. How do you view that?
Yeah, I think there's, if a project's incentivizing like sibling for like vanity metrics, there's kind of nothing you can do about it. Like they're just like, there's just like an improperly implemented system, but it's like very easy to think that that's like helpful. It's helpful maybe short term, but like long term, it's not helpful. When it comes to like whales versus retail, I think in an optimal world, there is always some sort of, boost that you can provide to retail, to like the smaller players. Like that is kind of like a desirable outcome, right? Like even if you provide like a minor boost, it's like, it is kind of like desirable. The issue is that there isn't really a way to do that on chain, because it's not like, if an address belongs to retail or if it's just like a Sybil account from a whale. Like there's no information that you have on that. And because you don't have that information, you can't actually design a system to reward those retail, basically. So whenever I've been able to contribute to any sort of incentive design, I typically try to not think about whale versus retail, and more so just think about how can you, perfectly, to the extent that you can, capture in like a numerical way the contribution that someone provides, right? So in the in the case of like Blast, as an example, is like you get points like every block for your balance, right? So if you deposit 1 ETH and you hold that for a bit, you're earning a certain amount of points. If you deposit 1,000 ETH, you're also getting points, and it's like perfectly proportional. So that is actually kind of like that sort of system is kind of just like perfectly fair in a way. It does mean like the whales are going to get more, but like they're also putting in 1,000x more, right? So it's like it's perfectly proportional. Something that I see a lot of is people try to like curve down the reward. So they're like, oh, if you deposit like 1,000 ETH, you're not, and you got like 1,000x the points, we're actually going to like curve that at the very end. And that's pretty suboptimal, because basically all that does is it just means the whales are actually just going to split their deposits across like a lot of different accounts. And then, the only thing you think you're interacting with like, 100,000 users, but you're actually only interacting with like 1,000 users, right?
Maybe even less.
Yeah, probably even less, honestly. Like a lot, some of these ecosystems is like almost definitely less. But then they have like the craziest metrics, right? And those metrics, maybe for some of the projects, like maybe it is like a beneficial thing, like short term, it gives them the attention. So it's like, it is kind of a trade-off. Whenever I've thought about it though, I guess maybe it's just more like a personal inclination thing. It just seems like a waste and almost like a grift to kind of like chase those like vanity metrics. Those vanity metrics, if they're real, are great, right? Like if you're actually getting 100,000 users and they're all doing this and generating like real activity, like that's awesome. But if it's just like, inorganic and faked, I think it's just, it just doesn't feel good to like have that sort of like system. And it's also just, again, like long-term not beneficial. So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of like how I think about it.
It's so interesting actually hearing you say this, because I think like within the NFT lending space, I remember when Blend came out and all of the builders were talking about it, it was very much like, it's really hard for us to count what's real volume versus incentivized volume. And you hear that a lot. And like even looking at Blast and how you're distributing Blast Gold to these apps, I kind of feel like vanity metrics is a dirty word now. But like when we were talking about it and breaking it down, it was kind of like, okay, gold is being distributed to dApps based off of like the KPIs that would be the most important to them. And we immediately were like, okay, it's the vanity metrics. It's like number of transactions. It's your user retention, your user count, your volume. And so I think in my head, I'm having a little bit of like a hard time. Like I hear what you're saying and I totally agree, but I'm having like a little bit of a hard time reconciling that because I think I do see hints of it.
Yeah. It's a great question. One is, these incentive systems are like very, very hard to design. So sometimes there are like emergent outcomes where it's like, oh, there might be some like inflation going on of some sort. And it's not about like, it's never like a spectrum. Like it's never 100% vanity or like 100% real. It's somewhere in the middle. And the question is like, can you get it more to the real side of the spectrum than the not real? So it's always more like of an ideal. We've talked a lot about like the Blur incentives specifically, which are like a very specific instance. For Blast, that one is it's a more complex problem because on the point side, which is for TVL, that's like 100% not vanity because it's just based on, it's literally just like based on the TVL. So it's just like, you can't fake the TVL, like you can't fake liquidity. It's not like I can like copy paste my ETH, right?
Yeah.
That would be a big problem.
So liquidity is one of those things that's like very, very hard to fake. Volume is one of those things that is like very easy to fake in many regards. So it's really just a matter of like, for like the gold, it's really just a matter of like looking at each specific dApp and trying to think through like, what are the KPIs that can be authentic and what are the KPIs that like, can be easily faked, but maybe you can get some like other signals to try to get like a sense of like authenticity. So, when it comes to like a DEX, for example, maybe they can fake their, volume, maybe they can fake the number of users, but they can't fake liquidity. That's just, and they can't fake the tightness of the liquidity, right? So, if you have a DEX and you have like a lot of liquidity for like ETH USDB, like around the mark price, right? So if ETH USDB is like 3,500 and there's like $1 million of liquidity within like the plus or minus 2% range, like you can't fake that. So those things are like 100% like not vanity metrics.
Like those are more of your like concrete signals of like there is clearly on-chain traction here.
Right.
Got it.
Those are very concrete signals. The other things like the volume or the users, those are like very easy to fake basically. So those you probably, you can still like look at, but you kind of have to, and this is why like in all of the official communication, it's always been specified. It's a combination for the gold specifically. It's a combination of, objective and subjective metrics because like some of the stuff like TVL, very reasonable to be like objective about, but some of the other stuff, it's like hard. So it's like, when it comes to looking at those metrics, then we start to look at like, oh, like, are we seeing usage from on crypto Twitter, right? Like when we're in Discords, do we see people talking about it and using it? When we just like talk to some users ourselves and they say, hey, these are like the DEXs that we're using, or these are the protocols that we're using, are they mentioning, that protocol? And if there's like a protocol that's just like not mentioned at all and has these like crazy metrics,
Insane
and it's
numbers,
like,
yeah.
it's like, okay, that
You're
clearly
like,
that's
flag.
not it. Yeah, we just like don't look at that. And then the other thing you'll notice is that for the gold distribution, this system might change, but I think the general like process is probably going to stay pretty similar. But basically, for each dApp, we give it like a score, and it's not like a precise score, right? It's like 1, 3, or 6, I think was for this first distribution, or maybe like 1, 3, 5. But basically like these are like really like rough buckets. And the reason why they're like rough buckets versus being like exactly precise is because it's very hard to have like a precise measure of these things. But we felt pretty comfortable. We felt that we could be fairly accurate if we had these like rough buckets, right? So if we were precise, we'd probably be inaccurate. But by being kind of more like rough about it, in terms of like high level scores, we felt like we could have like a higher degree of confidence that the score was accurate.
Yeah. Because it's a range. It's not so black and white.
Yeah, exactly.
I have so many questions about that, but I feel like you want to touch on USDB.
Yeah, I will. I want to take a quick break from points. I'm sure we're going to come back to it.
I was going to say, we definitely are
Like,
because I
we're
have questions.
When you first announced Blast, I think there were a few things that caught my eye. Number one was I remember you making some sort of statement that was along the lines of like, I want to create institution level perps. And in order to create that environment, we need something like Blast. And now we all of a sudden have like this insane native yield L2, which it's kind of funny because when you zoom out anyways, you're kind of like, why wasn't this just like baked in? Like I think the mid-curve take is like, oh, well, you can go to Lido and deposit. And I'm just like, why would I do that when I can just have it already doing that for me, which I love. But a lot of what you talk about is like, I want to create the highest yield environment possible. Like, what does that look like to you, like tangibly beyond what we're currently seeing on Blast?
Yeah, it's a number of the things. There's a few aspects that are like direct, like obvious things, and then I think there's more long-term developments. In terms of like the short-term developments, one is just like the baseline interest rate on Blast is just like higher than any other L2, right? Like it's like you're saying, it's like if you keep your ETH or USDB on Blast, you're automatically earning 3 to 4% on your ETH and 10 to 15% on your USDB, and you don't have to think about it. You're just getting that, and those users maybe in a world, maybe without Blast, maybe they would be putting it into like Lido and MakerDAO, but like odds are they probably wouldn't be. And so now those users just like are by default earning around like 100 to 150 million in yield that, annually that they weren't earning before. Like that's like a lot of money,
Totally.
just like baseline. But then the second thing is now the users also don't need to make a choice between earning that yield and using the dApps, because normally it's like, oh, if I am holding this ETH, I'm not earning the yield. If I put it into like Lido, maybe I'm earning the yield. But then if I want to start using it in a dApp, I now need to like convert it. And so it's like odds are you're probably gonna keep some like pool of ETH just like in your hot wallet like all the time. That's like not earning yield just to go between the dApps. So now you're just like your baseline is like you're not going to be earning that yield. Versus on Blast, again, it's just like it's the default for everyone. Like you can't avoid it, and so you're just like automatically just like earning more than anywhere else. But then when it comes to the dApps themselves, it is also now, because of this native yield, is also, and the funny thing is like also like the term native yield has been like co-opted by other protocols, but they're like, it's not actually native yield, which is like a funny separate thing to talk about. But basically now that these dApps have this native yield, they can actually build new types of applications that take advantage of it that weren't possible before. And so now that's just like a higher yield environment because you have these apps, utilizing the yield that didn't exist before. And I can give examples of that. The third aspect is I think that there's likely emergent outcomes here where, because once the yield is just like pervasive throughout the entire system, you probably just have new opportunities and metas that develop that are extremely rewarding for both the users and the developers that just like weren't possible at all before. And I think like a good intuition for this is when you think about like one example, like something that's possible on Blast is it basically enables like new business models. So if you're like a perp dex and you have like 100 million TVL, normally the way you monetize that is you charge trading fees to your users, right? And that's like a tried and true business model. But the other way you can do that is on Blast is you can actually just monetize the yield. That 100 million TVL, if it's like USDB, if it's like a stable coin, which is probably the default for a perp dex, you're going to be earning around 10 to 15 million in yield annually, and that's like basically like totally invisible to the users. And so now you're earning like all this revenue, and your users, you can actually charge your users zero trading fees. And so it's like a zero trading fee like perp dex. Where have we seen zero trading fee trading apps before? Robinhood, right? Robinhood, they came out and they launched like the first like zero trading fee app for stocks, and that had profound impacts on the market, right?
Especially retail.
Retail. It enabled the entire, like Wall Street Bets meta, and just like retail participation just like completely changed, and it basically just like forever altered like the stock like market landscape. Similarly, I think for Blast, it's like the direct effect is, oh yeah, maybe you have some dApps that the users earn the yield and the dApps maybe incorporate the yield, but I think like the secondary emergent effects are actually like it could have as significant of an impact on the broader market as Robinhood did on the stock market.
I love that like long-term vision. There is one thing I want to go back and tap on, which is where the native yield comes from. Obviously, native yield on Blast doesn't come from nowhere. We know for ETH it comes from Lido, and for USDB right now it's coming from MakerDAO. Recently, MakerDAO had to change its DSR to 15%, which is why we are now earning 15% on USDB on Blast. But I feel like in the last few days, we've kind of seen, I I think, I don't know if I want to call it irresponsible behavior, but we've seen some like odd stuff that hasn't really been characteristic of like how conservative MakerDAO is usually, with like the decisions that they make and the proposals that they do. But like I'm seeing conversations on, you know, from Aave leadership about like, do we need to lower this LTV? Like what they're doing is really reckless. Like how are you thinking about that from the perspective of Blast? Because like, God forbid, DAI goes into death spiral. Like that would heavily affect the entire Blast ecosystem. Is this something that you would actually look to build out yourself so you're not having to rely on third parties? Like,
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me start off by talking about the system design for this, and then I will talk about like MakerDAO specifically, which is like the current implementation of the system. So the high level system design is that the Blast Bridge is able to implement different strategies for earning yield. To start with, it's Lido and MakerDAO, but in the future, once like further community governance is enabled, the community will basically be able to diversify away from those strategies, and it could either have multiple strategies, or it could just like fully replace the strategies. And basically, what this system design allows for is that if Maker was determined to be like a suboptimal strategy, or even just like for like general diversification, it's healthy to have multiple different providers of yield. And in each individual provider, you want to make sure that they are earning the yield in like a relatively safe manner, right? So like for like on-chain T-bill protocols are like good candidates, and then of course like just like other LST protocols are good candidates. And it's of course like the community, it's important for the community and for us as we try to support and steward the community to basically assess the risk and the stability of each individual strategy. But like in the limit, what is possible is you effectively have yield coming from multiple diversified strategies that are independently like fairly like low risk, and then collectively are like very low risk, right? Because you have these like multiple strategies and it's diversified. So like that's like the high level like system design, which is sound. Then the it's basically like as good as you're going to get it, and the system also has basically this like insurance pool that builds up over time as well. So then it allows for if there were ever some sort of like catastrophic systemic event across like all of those strategies at once, like for like whatever reason, like I don't know, maybe like Ethereum just like goes down, right? Like something like crazy like that.
Some crazy
it's
black
like,
swan event.
Right.
We've
like
seen it before.
it can happen in like a technical sense or theoretical sense, but basically in that world, then it's like you still provide like multiple buffers. The current world that we live in is that the primary strategies are Lido and MakerDAO. And on the MakerDAO side, they've been around for like a very, very long time. And, it's been a protocol that when we first, like chose the initial strategies, like we set the initial parameters, right? And then the community is able to set it from there, but we set the initial parameters. On the Lido side, we felt that Lido was the safest because it's got over like $20 billion locked up in it. It's been around for a while. So that's basically like a $20 billion bug bounty that's been live for like years at this point. So that's like a fairly good strategy to bet on. And then similarly, MakerDAO, they have billions in TVL. It's been around for multiple years as well. And that community has effectively stewarded MakerDAO through like crazy market conditions, like way crazier than we see now, and they've come out on the other side of it. So MakerDAO also seemed like a pretty reasonable strategy. When it comes to the recent controversy, which is like them and Athena, I think it is like a bit of a mixed bag. I would say the bright side, regardless, is that it's not that they're using Athena for like 100% of the yield. It's I think it's like 20% of the like MakerDAO collateral is like in Athena or something like that. Those numbers are like just like vaguely remembering it. Would have to dig into specifics to find the exact ones, but basically it's a smaller portion of the total portfolio. So MakerDAO, kind of like similar to the like bridge system design that I share, like they have multiple different strategies and they have multiple different sources of yield. So MakerDAO's entire system design is also basically to, diversify its sources of yield. And that's what enables it to basically survive these adverse events. So I feel pretty confident in MakerDAO overall, just because they have such a history of navigating it. It's not just a matter of trusting their judgment and just like completely excluding our own. For this recent specific instance, we also dug into ourselves, and we also talked to a number of very, very deep technical on-chain just like MEV players that are in my experience, basically the best adversarial thinkers in the space. Like I have not found a better adversarial thinker than some of the people that we've been able to work with. And these people, they basically made all their wealth by breaking protocols. So they're very, very good at it. And they just have a mind for it. They are very, very deep into that ecosystem. And when we asked them for their additional perspective, they felt at the current levels that they felt it was fine, basically. So, there's a number of signals here, but across, both the general trust in MakerDAO, both the third-party perspectives from experts that we trust, and then also from our own evaluation, we still feel comfortable, utilizing MakerDAO as a strategy. With that said, though, in the future, in the near future, if the community were ever to feel that a more diversified strategy would make sense, or even to replace MakerDAO entirely, that is something that the community will be able to do, and that's going to be a program that we put into place.
Got it. I know we're running a little short, so what do you want to dig into?
Cool. Yes, let's go. We could do these kind of more rapid fire, if that's cool by you. One of the things that you were touching on. Oh God, I have so many questions. One of the things I really wanted to ask you about is loyalty. So this is something, points program we've talked about quite a bit, right? Loyalty is something that you brought into the space, and you're like, look, you use OpenSea, sorry, bro. That's just how it works. When you guys announced Blast, one of my first thoughts was fuck, what's going to happen to people that are using other L2s, right? Are you going to take a similar approach to saying all right, it's not OpenSea anymore. We've gone up to the big leagues. If you're using Arbitrum, hate to break it to you, sorry. And we've seen this now with dApps, right? You put them into the 1, 3, and 6 bucket. You're if you have a platform or you're serving on another blockchain,
1.5.
Yeah. You're not going to get the same kickbacks. Is that something that you guys have thought about? How are you thinking about, are you looking for people to be more Blast native? And we're already seeing a flourishing ecosystem that has happened in a month? It's insane. So it's working.
Yeah, I would say the core driver for any decision we make is not, it's not winning market share or having loyalty. Those are not the outputs that we care about. It's more so about how can we define contributions to the ecosystem. And if loyalty is something that contributes significantly to the ecosystem, then we want to define that. And if it's not, then we're not going to define it. And it's more so about how do we, fairly evaluate the contributions to the ecosystem. So that's the core driver. Loyalty is one of those factors. But when it comes to, loyalty for users in general, I'm not a fan of retroactive surprises. I think that's a bit of a rug, right? If at the end we were just oh, by the way, all of these users who use these other L2s are we're wrecking you. That's just unfair.
It would be war on the timeline.
Yeah,
it would be insane.
Yeah, it'd be a very eventful day, but I think that would just be a betrayal of trust. Yeah. So I really don't like that, which is also why it's when with any sort of incentive system, we try to be very explicit about how it works, what's allowed, what's not allowed. It's sometimes very, very hard, but in general, that's our ideal, because we want to make it very clear to the user, hey, this is what's being rewarded. And if we need to make changes, we try to make it in a fair way, right? So we kind of have a commitment to the community to stay along certain guidelines of behavior. We don't have infinite flexibility. And then within those guidelines, then we kind of have our design space. So when it comes to loyalty, to the extent that it is beneficial to the community, it's like basically we're always going to be thinking about how do we better define contributions to the ecosystem. But regardless of what we do, we would always try to do it in a fair way that's not necessarily like retroactively punishing people.
Surprise, yeah.
That makes sense. I guess another just like rapid fire question, like we have not seen a robust NFT ecosystem on any L2. I know this is something you mentioned in the developer AMA. I would love to, if you could just paint the vision of like what a robust NFT ecosystem looks like to you, specifically on Blast, and like if there's anything you're seeing from NFT projects or that you want to see NFT projects explore more.
Yeah, I think that in general, these ecosystems develop. If you think about like every market cycle, it's not like randomness. Like people talk about like market cycles, but the reason why they operate in cycles is not necessarily like the rule of law of the market. It's actually more so due to like the underlying market developments and improvements that like enable these like boom cycles. So like, for example, in 2013, it was like Coinbase enabling retail to buy Bitcoin. Like that's like a huge catalyst, right? And then that enables that movement. 2017, it was like Ethereum launching and enabling smart contracts and ICOs, which is like new capital formation. And that enabled like another huge wave. 2020, it was like DeFi, again, like another, now you can actually like trade on chain and do other stuff. Like that's like another huge wave. So pretty much like every single cycle is driven by like fundamental developments and improvements in the infrastructure. When it comes to like L2s, what I've noticed is that we haven't had that sort of cycle, and I think it's due to the underlying developments and like the market infrastructure just like not being there. One aspect of it is having very fleshed out like NFT marketplaces, right? Like you just need NFT marketplaces for these things to just like function. That's an example of one. It's a great one, but basically you need that. But then also when it comes to L2s, I think it's really only interesting if you can do new things on the L2s. So it's like, what are new things that you can do? Well, one aspect of L2s is like, sure, as a baseline, they're all like faster, cheaper. So you can probably do like larger collections or do like more novel things there. But then another aspect is like, what I noticed as like a builder from like the builder perspective, one of the largest impetuses for Blast was, when I was contributing to Blur, like in the process of contributing to Blur, we looked at a bunch of different L2s and we dug into them technically. We also talked with their teams, their CEOs. And what we found was none of them were providing anything that particularly resonated with us as builders. And the reason why is because they didn't really enable like anything new. The reason why we felt Blast was not we, meaning my co-founder and I, they're different, like orgs contributing to the different projects. But my co-founder and I, the reason why we felt it was necessary to create Blast was because we realized that it was possible to build an L2 that actually enabled new types of applications. And that's not just for the dApps, but even just for the assets. And a great example is actually, and it's very regrettable because of the hack, but Munchables was actually a very interesting new implementation for NFTs. The way it worked was that you could basically like lock your funds for like a 30-day period, and then you get to mint the NFT in return.
For free.
For free.
Yeah.
And this was like, it was a very popular mechanism. Like it went from like 0 to 100 million TVL like instantly.
Instant.
Like I want to say like within 2 days, it was like so fast. It was like shockingly fast. And I think one of the reasons why it happened so fast was like, one, of course, there's just like a lot of like monetary velocity on Blast in general. But then the second thing is it is like this like novel mechanism that is like a new way of minting NFTs. And it's not without precedent. So like actually like a random fun fact is in South Korea, you don't rent houses by paying like a monthly rent. You actually rent houses by depositing a large amount of money with the owner, and then they actually just earn the yield on those deposits. And then when you leave, you get to get your money back.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's like a really
That's
weird
like really cool
system, right? But that's basically like what Munchables was, but like for NFTs, and it works really well in South Korea. So like this is like a new type of model that just like doesn't exist anywhere else. And so these types of things are what enable new metas to develop, because it's like they're the underlying market developments that basically enable like new creativity, new types of applications, new value for users that was previously basically like locked away. So that is what I mean when I talk about like an L2 NFT ecosystem. Is like there has to be not just like the underlying activity, which is the output, but also like the input is that there's basically like new types of experiences, products that you can create that aren't possible on ETH1 today.
Were you at any point in the Munchables hack, like there was a lot of chat on the chain about you guys running back the chain and things like that, and the centralization versus decentralization conversation. What was going through your mind during that time? And like, was that a realistic possibility, and what would be the ramifications in your mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were very fortunate in that it never got to that point where we even were, deep into that discussion, because all of our focus was on how can we support the Munchables team to basically try to navigate the situation as effectively as possible to maximize the likelihood of recovering the funds. When it comes to, and so like, I wouldn't be able to give a specific answer because like we never even got to the point of like really, really debating it. But I think something that I noticed on like crypto Twitter, and this is like a level of nuance that I think was missed, is that it's not just like a binary thing. It's actually a question of time as well. You really need to look at that, right? So like today, Ethereum like hard forking because like a dApp gets hacked. dApps get hacked all the time on Ethereum. Ethereum doesn't hard fork, and it's a decentralized and robust ecosystem such that like it can withstand those hacks. But that's today. If you revert back to like 2016 when Ethereum was in its infancy, they actually went through a very similar situation, actually like similar amounts of capital as well. And what Ethereum did in that situation when the DAO got hacked was they hard forked, and it was so controversial it created ETC. So it was super, super controversial, but that move, we'll never know what would have happened if they didn't do this. But I think, it's fair to say that move is what saved Ethereum. It allowed the community to recover its funds, to continue building out the ecosystem, and now create this like robust, super decentralized ecosystem. So I think when evaluating that decision, you really need to think about the time component and like at what stage is this chain in its development cycle. So I think for Blast, that's something that we definitely would have like looked at very heavily. But in terms of like what the answer would have been, I can't say just because like we haven't done enough, like we never got to that point.
Right.
Yeah. I think I have one more question.
Yep.
So I don't know you very well, Pacman. Like obviously been covering your work, farming on Blast. We have DM'd a little bit here and there, but I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but when I look at you, I see someone who is very young, very driven, has clearly, you push yourself. And I feel like in order to do that, because not everyone can do it, you're probably highly critical and very reflective of the things that you do. I would love to know, like, looking back at the past few projects and specifically Blast, like, where do you feel like the areas of improvement are? And then like, what's your North Star that you're building towards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like that question because I feel like you're a very highly critical person. Like that was so apparent. Like as soon as I walked in and you were adjusting the camera, so that was like awesome. Actually, what I've noticed is like typically people that execute at a high level are typically like very, very critical. So I like that question. When it comes to Blast and execution, I think there's like some like general things that were kind of like unavoidable. Like one of the things about Blast that's very interesting is just building out an ecosystem and supporting the teams building on the ecosystem. Like I would like to spend all of my time just like with the teams building, but you just need like manpower for that, right? You need like hands on deck. And so just like scaling up that operation to support the teams, like that's just something that we're like running into, right? And we're gonna need to do, and that's gonna be like a learning experience. So like there's like that as like one aspect of it. But I think something that that's like a little bit like less controllable because it was kind of just inevitable to a certain extent. Something that was a little bit more controllable that I think that we're now rectifying is if you look at Blast today, there's actually a headwind that's kind of like holding back the ecosystem, like artificially. And the headwind is you earn points for holding your ETH and your USDB. You can earn gold by using dApps, but you don't earn anything for holding like tokens or native assets on Blast. So it's like as soon as you move out of your ETH, you're basically like incentivized to like sell as quickly as you can because or unless you're like really believing in it, because there's like a large incentive to hold those other assets or to deploy into dApps. And basically that is this like artificial headwind that is like holding back people from like deploying into different things in the ecosystem that we've actually heard from users like, hey, we really want to like buy these assets, whatever they be, whether they're NFTs or tokens, but we're just like, as soon as we do it, we're like no longer earning the points or gold, and that's like a huge disincentive. So that is that is an emergent outcome from like the current like system design, which is like, it's a very incentivizing, creating an incentive system for like a layer is just like much more complicated and complex than for like an individual application. So, I'm not necessarily like beating ourselves too much on that, but I think that like that is like a very solvable problem. So one of the things that I'm like most excited about is actually, solving that incentive issue. We have a number of designs that we think will do it like effectively. And I'm really excited for that because right now you just kind of have, it's like you have this ecosystem where there's $2.5 billion on it, and you have a user base that's basically like the most active base of like on-chain users like in the entire space. But they're basically just like, artificially restricted and shackled due to this current like system design. So I think just like with a few tweaks, it can actually like unlock, basically just like free them to do what they would normally want to do. That's something that I'm really excited about. And I think we can improve that.
I love that.
I think that's like a great note to end on.
I was like, dude, this is, because I'm one of those people, I'm just like, fuck.
I know, I'm like, buy this, buy this.
Like, I can't. Yeah. As we wrap up, last minute alpha, anything that you want to share, floor is yours. Anything that you feel like is important to share, this is your time.
Yeah, I think that this is like touching on to my previous point, but something that like I really want to see less of, like the most, is when you see dApps, and this is like across I'm not talking about Blast specifically, but I mostly know this in some other chains, but when you see basically like dApps farming the users, that's like a really, really negative outcome, because the users are like the lifeblood of the ecosystem, and it's just like this like adversarial environment. I think that for users, it's like very hard to put the onus on them to basically like study these things in depth. And then also for a lot of these dApps is like, if they have opaque systems, and they can kind of like change them and rug at will. So it's like very, very hard to put that onto the users. But I think something that I would stress the most is that if the user can kind of try to think about, for each dApp, if they have an incentive system, or if they have like any sort of, incentive system or no incentive system, if you just like look at the dApp and you can try to just like evaluate like, okay, are they aligned with the user on the same time horizon, right? So is the dApp only getting rewarded when the user gets rewarded? Is the dApp only succeeding over a long time horizon, because that's how the user is going to get rewarded as well? Is the dApp like transparent in their communications? I think if the users like paid attention to those signals more, and kind of diverted attention away from the teams that like are not really playing fair, I think that ends up creating a better systemic outcome, because now the dApps that should get the attention, and the dApps that shouldn't get the attention don't get the attention. So if there's like one thing, I think it's just like for the users, basically just like really, really try to pay attention to that and try to lean into the dApps that are, being fair and transparent.
Sounds like another video.
I was going to say more video content.
All right, I'm going to go sprint. Thank you so much for your time.
This was awesome.
Like, we'll have to do like a part 2 sometime.
Yeah, I would love to at some point.
Yeah. Awesome. But guys, we hope you enjoyed that. This is, I don't have words. I don't have words, but I think that's it.
Wrapping up.
Bearish or bullish until the next one. Thanks for tuning in.